Hello, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to this presentation, which is part of an ongoing GOOS webinar series about aspects of global sustained ocean observing. My name is Albert Fisher. I'm director of the Global Ocean Observing System Office based here at the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO. And for the next hour, we'll start with an approximately 30-minute presentation on OceanGliders by Brad deYoung. Brad is based at Memorial University in Newfoundland and is co-chair, along with Pierre Testor, who's also joining us for the questions of the OceanGliders team. After the presentation, we'll conduct a question and answer session using the question window. It's open right now. You can start asking clarifying questions if you'd like, and please ask your question by pressing the send to all button so we can all see your questions. I'll moderate and select and ask the questions verbally. And the session is being recorded, and you'll find the recording later on YouTube and on the GOOS website as well. Brad, I'll turn it over to you for your presentation.
Great, and thank you, Albert, and good morning, everyone. It's a little bit like giving a presentation in a darkened room or something where you can't see who's listening, but I'm going to talk about the Global Glider Program, and this is an initiative that includes quite a wide group of people from across the globe. So Pierre and I are co-chair, but you can see the names of others who are involved in this from the US, from Australia, Canada, Germany, and a much wider group who are active in the program. So I'll try to tell you a little bit about what is it really, what we have done, what we're presently doing, and where we're headed, what we're intending to do. So OceanGliders within the JCOM world is still described as an emerging network. We think of ourselves as somewhat beyond adolescence, but perhaps not yet fully mature. So we're headed in that direction. And here's a list of our terms of reference. And really, the intent is to build. And these are expressions of that intent, a global observing network that is truly sustainable and feeds into the global ocean observing system. And so to do that, there are various things that we have to do. One is to set standards, another is to enhance and support data exchange, and the other is to really, offer guidance to the community about how to put together program activities, because a glider network will look a little different perhaps than an Argo network in terms of how it functions. But as we look around the network world of ocean observing, there are differences between lots of different networks. And so in going through examples this morning, I'll give you some some idea of our intention and how the program is developing. And so the program comes from or was guided by a white paper from the Ocean Obs of a decade ago now, a community white paper that proposed the formation of such a system, the need to adopt global standards, a target line for or target activity of maintaining 20 standard lines within the coming 5 years, so by 2014, and I'll show you where we are a little on that, and then various aspects of how that network would function. And that community proposal and the plans around that, led to an approval, which is only a couple of years old now, of this as an emerging network within JCOM. And as does GOOS, we see three kind of broad areas of focus for this. One is around climate services. So this is potentially through making measurements around boundary current systems or water mass transformation, which I'll talk about more later. Operational services, one of the ideas we've thought about is around hurricanes and making measurements in extratropical storms. I'll also talk about that. And finally, around using gliders as platforms for making biogeochemical measurements, which obviously is pretty relevant if you're making measurements in the boundary current systems where biological and fisheries issues and biogeochemical issues are pretty significant. So these two figures show a somewhat incomplete, though fairly close to complete, indication of glider activity before 2009 and since 2009. And since 2009 could even have more red lines on it. But it shows some areas of activity that are persistent. You can see some of the repeated lines off New England and the Gulf of Mexico, some work in Baffin Bay that's carried on. But you can see that there are also additional lines and a lot more activity. So clearly in the last decade, since that 2009 white paper was written, there's been a growing level of both interest and real activity in the glider community. This is, of course, all of the glider activity, and our intent is to provide more support and coordination for this, and also to build real sustainability in some of these lines that you see, and I'll show how we're intending to go about that. So as an official international entity, we really only date back to 2016, where we were, endorsed later by JCOM, but announced ourselves at the 7th EGO international meetings that have been held intermittently over the last, or every couple of years over the last 15 or so years, a little longer. So since that meeting, we've also supported a data workshop, data meeting that was held in Genova in Italy last fall. And so we've recognized that data issues are one of the key challenges, and I'll talk more about that because we have a task team within the network that's focused on data issues. But there was a substantial multi-day conference looking at bringing together across the world standardizations and improvements in data management and data sharing. And only a couple of weeks ago now, we held a meeting in Rutgers, New Jersey, which was then the 8th meeting, including EGO, Everyone's Glider Organization, and not the most wonderful sounding acronym, but UG2, which is the Underwater Glider Group of the United States, together with this group, OceanGliders, the international entity. And so that meeting brought together about 120 people from across the planet, and had a really, good engagement from people in Asia and the Pacific, groups that we would like to further bring into the global discussions around how to conduct glider operations. And so that was a multi-day meeting. There was a data management workshop at the front of that meeting, and we had a meeting of the steering group of OceanGliders following that meeting to further our plans to move forward. So OceanGliders, Pierre and I co-chair, but includes representatives. There are representatives from Australia, but we really intend, and I'll further mention this at the end, to broaden the representation on that steering group to include others from Asia, and also to improve our gender diversity. But this group has endorsed 4 kind of primary areas of interest, and they're identified here: one around boundary ocean observations, one around storms, one around water mass transformation, and one around data management. And so data management is clearly the most cross-cutting initiative because it applies to every aspect of glider operations. And so it is one of, the challenges, partly because gliders are new technology, new tools, and we're also continually adding new sensors to them, which pose yet additional kinds of challenges. And just more generally, because moving data from science platforms or from this kind of technology to direct societal benefit, particularly through the global telecommunication system, GTS, is still not entirely straightforward, and we're working to make that more functional. So just on the data management task team, this is being led by Dan Hayes, who's from the University of Cyprus. And this is really to promote and coordinate collaboration, as it says here, to offer tools for the international program. Like pretty much all of us now, we're trying to follow, the FAIR principles of data use, that they be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And it's easy to endorse, or relatively easy to endorse the principles. It's a little more challenging to fully realize them. So this activity is linked to various in other international data management activities, and some of the European ones are listed there: EGO and GROOM, EuroGOOS, EMODNet, US IUS, there's a Canadian IUS program, and IMOS, the Australian group. And some of the names of people who have been active in this group are listed there. And it's a clear mix of oceanographers, people who are working on data management, engineers, people who have somewhat more of a pure glider focus, but also people with a more of a data management focus. One thing that we have been able to do with support primarily from European entities, agencies at the moment, is to hire a technical coordinator position at JCOM Ops, Victor Turpin, who's only been there a few weeks or a month or so. And the primary goal of that group is to support the metadata management, and it's a key kind of step in this kind of data support. So that's a good thing. One of the things we've made some progress on following the meeting in Rutgers is to try to get further support for that position from the US, Canada, Germany, Australia, and France, and the UK. And we are working on that now, and there's some signs that that may come together. In terms of membership on these working groups, it's pretty open. We tried to communicate openly, and writing the white paper for OceanObs 19 was a good opportunity to highlight the needs and the activities associated with the OceanGliders program. So there are kind of 3 working groups within the OceanGlider Data Management Task Team, which is the code for that OGDMTT, which looks like one of my airline tickets or something. And so the first is around harmonization of metadata and simple variables. So right now we have several different approaches to metadata management, not surprisingly, because regionally the Australians, the US, North Americans, and Europeans have all solve this problem on their own. It's also a function of the fact that we have 3 or 4 different vendors that build these vehicles, the gliders, some in the US, some in Europe. And so there are differences there. Some discussion about how to organize the DACs, the data assembly centers. Quality control is obviously a central issue for this, and the question of how to do this in real time, because one significant intended use of the glider data is to feed the GTS system. And so quality control flags going into that system are important. And the group at the bottom on the buffer technology, which is a binary format discussion, is really because at present through the GTS there isn't a dedicated format for gliders. So we use a buoy format, which is somewhat imperfect. And so we have to figure out a better way to actually format these data going into the GTS. And the other is around knowledge performance indicators and best practices. And so both within the data team and more broadly across the other aspects of the glider program, we're collaborating with those in the sort of global discussion around best practices in ocean observing. And Emma Heslop is leading that initiative within the group, and we're still developing how to best coordinate that. This speaks to some of the issues around the data management concerns about that. And we're trying to set and communicate those best practices and then share those as widely as possible. So one of the other task teams led by Dan Rudnick from Scripps is around the Boundary Ocean Observing Network, short for is BOON. And this is recognizing that there are a substantial number of kind of key issues that occur in the coastal boundary zone, and we just list some of them here. Fisheries, westerly boundary currents themselves dominate the meridional transport there. We have eastern boundary currents, upwelling systems, things going on, and that the shelves themselves, and the boundary edge provides a communication link between the shelf or the coast and the open ocean. And so the proposal here is a global network of gliders to address this platform. And we recognize that there are other platform opportunities here, and there's a program within the OOPC, the Ocean Observing Panel on Climate, that's thinking about this as well, and we would clearly collaborate with those. And so, one question asked is, well, we've got almost 4,000 Argo floats in the ocean. Do they not, already deal with this? And if you look at, particular regions like, here off the California coast or off Argentina, the Argo floats don't really come up onto the shelf, and so they're out in the open ocean, so they're missing that. And so gliders, we think, make an appropriate kind of tool to link between the shelf and the open ocean. So here's just off, the California coast, glider lines showing the connection out into the kind of Argo sampling field. And the glider profiles can generate for the same period a large number of profiles and can provide that linkage between the coastal shelf and the open ocean. There are already a large number of programs that are running close to sustainable operations, and these blue lines show various existing glider programs that are already in place, running on a regular basis glider operations. There are more, clearly. The Southern Atlantic is a clear gap in this, as is the west coast of South America. So there's clearly room to expand these kind of operations, but they do already exist. The goal of the program is to coordinate these various activities to provide the kind of support that around quality control of the data, such as we were just talking about, but also operational support for the activities, and to demonstrate to the national groups that would operate these programs, because we see these as run by nations and not necessarily contributed in the same way another international ocean observing program might do it, to give them kind of support to show that they are part of a global program. So the goal is, and we've set this goal quite explicitly, to have 100 gliders operating in boundary currents. We're not going to tell you a precise deadline for this, but in the coming decade, we would like to realize this goal. And I'll talk about how this goal fits to the other program activities in a minute, but let me move on to talk about the Ocean Storms Task Team, which is led by Scott Glenn from Rutgers in New Jersey. And here's some of the justification for why one would focus on this, and this shows the cost for the United States of various kinds of environmental catastrophes, and about half of the cost and about half of the deaths are associated with tropical cyclones or hurricanes. And so it's something a little bit less than $1 trillion and 6,000 or 7,000 deaths. And if one looked around the planet, I think you could easily expect to find growing numbers. So over the last few decades, the forecast skill for, and this shows Atlantic Basin hurricanes, for the track error has increased quite dramatically on pretty much all timescales from 1 day out to multi-days. And if you look at the intensity forecast, it's not quite such a clear, steady track of improvement. On the long time scales, it's improved, but on short time scales, not so much. And so one aspect of this is that as the hurricanes approach shore, then they're running over the shelf. And so the ocean models that are used for the hurricane prediction are still imperfect on the shelf because of a lack of real-time shelf data and also because of the structure of the models. And so here are two well-known examples. One is Hurricane Irene from 2011, and it was a fairly substantial hurricane, but the impact of the hurricane, intensity of it, was dramatically over-predicted. The track was fairly well predicted, but the intensity warnings were over-predicted, and so I was actually in New York at the time of Hurricane Irene, and it was, panic in the streets, and the hurricane produced a lot of rainfall, but not much other damage. Hurricane Sandy, 2012, just a year later, produced much more damage, and the track again was accurately predicted, but the intensity was substantially under-predicted. And both of these are problems because false positives lead to people ignoring predictions and an overinvestment in preparation, and under predictions lead to poor preparation and the kinds of problems we saw in New York City. Lower Manhattan was without power for over a week. So there's clearly a gap here. And the goal then is, I've focused on US examples because we have those most nearly at hand, and there is some ongoing activity in the US, flying gliders in the track of hurricanes, but still not a fully operational program, and there are clearly lots of opportunities elsewhere in the world where tropical cyclones cause similar kinds of damage. So another and the final task team that we have, led by Pierre Testor, who's with us here online, and many others, is to focus on water mass transformation, recognizing that the scales of water mass formation, not just the open ocean water masses, which I'll refer to, the kind of deep water exchange processes, but also things that happen on the shelf, make gliders a good tool because of the scale and the intermittent character of water mass formation, and then the important or the recognized need to understand about the variability of this dynamics and water mass characteristics back to the kind of shelf and ocean modeling that's now become operational. So the open ocean formation zones, and you can see the various kinds of formation regions, primarily in the northern and southern hemisphere, for the Labrador Sea, Norwegian Sea, the Weddell and the Ross Seas, and that these occur, as the small yellow circles show, at quite small spatial scales. But there are, of course, other water mass formation events that occur on the shelf associated with winter convection in the Mediterranean Sea in the Gulf of Lion. So Gulf of Lion. So there are lots of areas of around the planet where this occurs, and this just shows off the Norwegian shelf the kind of spatial scale. This is a chlorophyll satellite image and shows the spatial scale of some of these water mass regions, and shows the short spatial scale and the highly complex regions. So there are lots of eddy, lots of frontal processes going on. And so the goal is to try to really measure in these kind of highly dynamic regions some of the key kind of spatial characteristics of them, which Argo floats, larger scale mooring programs are not going to be able to meet. So, so there are various ongoing activities. Each of these task teams is presently in place. They're at the meeting in Rutgers. There were various side group meetings of each of these groups, plans for how to make further progress, plans how to prepare these discussions to bring to the wider community, particularly at OceanOBS 19. So the goal will be to bring a couple of pages for each to give the global community some idea of the background around each of these activities, and to look for opportunities to connect, because while this has a glider focus, we recognize that gliders are only one component of the observing system, and we need to partner with others. So, as I mentioned as well, our goal is to further develop the sustainability for the technical coordinator position Victor Turpin holds at JCOM Ops. And so we've reached out to each of the nations that I mentioned, Canada, the US, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom and Australia, to provide support for this position. We'd like to, at the very least, encourage them to give this position a few years to demonstrate the real value and need for this. Presently, we only have funding for this year, and so we'd like to move beyond that. Expanding leadership, I mentioned our desire to spread the geographic footprint of the steering group for OceanGliders, to also expand the diversity. And so the steering group meeting that we held following the Rutgers meeting, we explicitly invited people to that group meeting to do that. And so we've already made progress on that, so that's encouraging. The data management is a key kind of challenge for the glider community, and we're trying to push or encourage the global community to form global standards and to support global integration of not just metadata, but the data themselves. And as I said, the 3 task teams are moving forward. In some sense, there are already activities. So looking forwards, the first thing that we want to focus on is to ensure that the funding for the technical coordinator is in place and is sustainable. And so, as I've mentioned earlier, we've approached Canada, the US, Australia, France, Germany, the UK to do this, the countries with a substantial investment in glider activities, where there are some signs that will come to pass. That would be really a good step for the community, I think. The other is that the OceanGliders steering committee, we want to expand the leadership of that to expand the geographic footprint, to have more involvement from Asia and the Pacific, and also to expand the diversity. And we made some progress on that following the Rutgers meeting, because we drew in more women to that meeting, and we're really going to make an effort to reach out to the Asian community. And there are opportunities within the storms and the boundary currents task teams to do that. So I think that will make progress in the coming months. We're clearly focused on the data management and improving access to and support for data transmission through the GTS system, and also the global coordination of the DACs centers. So we want to work on that and setting global standards for metadata. And then, we have plans and a white paper describing the task team interests. And we see OceanObs 19 as an opportunity to bring further background on each of those task teams to the global community, recognizing that while gliders are an appropriate vehicle for these measurements, there are other ways to make observations, and we need to be part of the global ocean observing effort. And so, the boundary currents, there's the OOPC initiative, there's certainly other groups with interest in storms and water mass transformation. And finally, we see the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development as an opportunity to really draw attention to the kind of growing global program of OceanGliders, and the decade itself as a platform, an arena in which to highlight those opportunities and to really build the sustainable program that we intend. So if the computer hasn't crashed again, I'll end there, and take any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brett, and I do apologize again for those technical problems. Also, I don't have a camera on this computer that works, so I will have to do it in listen only and talk only mode. We also have Pierre Testor, your co-chair, online, so I invite him to answer any of the questions and chime in as well. So thanks a lot. We do actually have a couple of questions already, so I'll jump right into them. We have two questions from Sotiris Kuroglu. Sorry if I mispronounced that. So the first question is, what's the potential of putting a microrider into play for studying glider-aided turbulent diffusion on an ocean scale? And what's the potential for vertical mode of operation of gliders for detecting and monitoring overturning circulation?
Let me give a couple of comments to each of those and say hi to Sotiris, who actually used to be a student here at Memorial quite a few years ago. I won't embarrass either of us by saying how many. So the first is that people have put microriders on gliders to measure turbulence, and there's a fair bit of interest. The thing about gliders is that they can be thought of as buses or taxis in some sense. You can keep plugging things into them. If you put large sensors on, though, you slow them down, and you also use power, obviously, and so it constrains the kind of operations that you can conduct. But there is interest from the global community in that particular measurement, turbulence measurements. You can also use the gliders in basically a mooring or buoy mode, where they're simply going up and down in a single place. But the real advantage of gliders, obviously, is that you can move them about to pick where you want to focus the target. But maybe, Pierre, you want to add something to either of those points?
Yeah, I can say that it is very interesting, and in particular because there are very few measurements of microturbulence. Usually they have been historically made from ship cruises, so there are not so many in the world. Now with the glider, it's a perfect platform to do that. It's slow. There is no motion. I mean, they are quite quiet. Sorry. So and you can do measurements close to the surface or close to the bottom. So it's very very interesting to make these measurements on using gliders. On the other hand, we don't know if there is a need to have really sustained observation for microturbulence. Is it a quest for a single parameterization of the process, or do we need to really measure that in a more sustained and global way? It's not clear yet.
Yeah, so that last point is worth emphasizing, because the goal of OceanGliders is to focus on sustained ocean observing. There is a lot of other glider interest or activity that has more of a scientific or specific programmatic or project focus, but OceanGliders is sustained observing to contribute to GOOS. thanks for the question. Thanks for that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brad.
In the question about overturning, sorry?
Yeah, go ahead, Pierre.
There was another question about overturning.
So the question was, is there potential to operate the gliders in a vertical mode for detecting and monitoring overturns?
Yeah, which I talked about a little bit and said, yes, there is. And the water mass transformation has a focus on making measurements in such a region. So,
yeah, exactly.
All right, apologies for the continuing technical problems.
Yeah.
So another question we have from Jay Perlman, which is, what's the potential for doing measurements of biological and ecological variables from gliders?
So, I mean, the answer is quite a lot. I mean, the thing about gliders, like any kind of autonomous vehicle platform, is the constraints around power. So obviously there are a lot of different sensors that are presently in play. So fluorometers, various nutrient sensors, pH sensors, acoustics, both passive and active acoustics, camera systems have all been deployed on gliders. But if you take that list, clearly it would be a challenge to put them all on a glider and fly them out because the batteries wouldn't last. And so you have to make some kind of selection around those. And for the long-term deployment of these sensors, there remain challenges around, drift and stability and calibration issues. But one of the advantages of gliders is you could fly the glider near another sensor for cross calibration, so near a mooring or near a vessel, something that's not so easy to do with a float or a drifter. So there are advantages to the glider in that sense, but there's a growing interest in those kinds of biogeochemical sensors, and also, as I said, active acoustic sensors. So the group from the Southwest Fisheries Center in California are flying gliders in the Antarctic to map krill using multi-frequency acoustics from 300 to 200 kilohertz, 38 to 200 kilohertz to replace their ship program. So I think that's a pretty clear example of the potential.
Thanks, Brad. Let me ask some more technical questions, and then I'll come back and ask some of the other questions. So there's a question about how possible is it to run gliders in the marginal ice zone and under sea ice?
So there has been quite a bit of work done on that. So there are 2 or 3 different groups with a focus in this kind of problem. The obvious, I think, person with the most experience is Craig Lee, who's flying sea gliders in the Beaufort Sea, and so there are obviously a bunch of challenges around this. People in Laval University has been flying gliders in Baffin Bay, and so navigation is one of the challenges, and so they've been using long-range underwater acoustic navigation systems to be able to navigate under the ice. And so they've successfully done that and flown those missions in marginal ice zones and in the Beaufort Sea. But the glider obviously wants to get to the surface to talk to satellites, both to upload data and to get a position. And so operating under sea ice and in ice conditions obviously adds risk and poses real challenges. And that's why it's clearly not a sort of everyday glider operation, I guess I would say, but it is one that there's demonstrated capability for, technology for. But I think if one were thinking about doing that, you'd have to kind of reach out to those groups that have developed those skills and developed those capabilities. And I think it's back in a global sense to the need to share best practices, and that's one thing we would like to see happen, that those with an interest in working in those regions could take advantage of the developments from those groups.
How do I unmute? Hey, Brad, I'm actually having quite a lot of technical difficulty, so I'm going to encourage you to open the question window and take a look at the questions directly, because there's quite a few of them,
Okay.
just in case I got cut off again. But I'll read the next one that we can ask, which is from Claudia Delgado. Do you have any capacity development plans? Have you organized training courses on glider-related topics? And you can answer that. And then the question after that is, if so, have you considered using Ocean Teacher to host or manage and share the contents?
So let me answer quickly, and then I'll pass it over to Pierre, who undoubtedly would have more. And the short answer is various national groups have held some workshops, and we've actually been talking about OceanGliders holding a workshop somewhere in Asia within the next year or two. And so we are interested in this and recognize the need for it. To my knowledge, no, it hasn't been discussed about Ocean Teacher, but Pierre may know more about that. Pierre?
Yes. No, I don't. We have not considered that until now. I think it would be a good idea. We would need probably to think on what would be the scope of such a presentation or teaching activity. In the community, there are actually several initiatives to make teaching activities related to gliders. I would like to advertise the Plocan Glider School that happens every year.
Right.
Where you can have the first hands on gliders of different kinds, and really have a first experience of the real operation. So it's more on the technical point of view. Concerning, there was also a school in Sweden not so long ago with different scopes. Sometimes it's only on one model of glider. Sometimes it's more on data visualization or something like that. But we probably need to be a bit better organized in the way we advertise all these initiatives.
Yeah, I think my expectation is that the task teams themselves may, further develop these kinds of, workshop activities. I think the Ocean Teacher is a good suggestion. And, some of the workshop capabilities or needs would be maybe around, data and operational uses, and some of them could be around more technical issues related to, like Jay's question about how to, put pH sensors on and how to calibrate them and how to use that data. So we recognize there's a big opportunity space out there for encouraging and bringing other users in, because we know there are a lot of groups that only operate a small number of gliders and don't have the technical support capacity that some others with a dozen or a few dozen gliders have. So it's a good question. Albert, I can't see the questions on my thing. I'm trying to fiddle around. So if I'm going to rely on you to keep feeding me questions.
Okay,
here.
well, I think I'm still here for the moment, so let's keep going. We have a question from Bryce Robert, which is about JCOM ops. What kind of key performance indicators are you looking for monitoring for from JCOM ops for the Ocean Glider network?
Oh, that's a good question. Do you have an answer to that, Pierre? I'm just...
Yes.
Oh, good.
Good. It's actually, there are many. We have the... First, there are key performance indicators we would like to set up to measure the capacity of our network to realize its objectives in terms of sampling, which means data coverage, sampling, and so on. So we have to make plans to make a design of the network and to check in real time, let's say monthly, how good are we with the glider operations, which means that the gliders are deployed, registered in the system, and the data are available. So, and to do that, then you have a lot of performance indicator in how well the data have been managed. I mean, are they arriving? Are they made public in real time? What does it mean? One could argue this is less than 24 hours, but we target for better than that, maybe 6 hours. So this would be, I mean, this is one single data managed to be public in less than 6 hours or not. And this is a performance indicator we will watch carefully. And it's really based on there are a lot of key performance indicators, especially because we are many teams managing the two-way communication system, so it's a bit fragmented in a way. So we have really to be careful on the performance on what we do.
So let me just add one thing to that, which we've really not yet even got a plan for how to assess, but we've been talking with, you know, some of the forecast model centers about their use of glider data, and we want to make some kind of assessment of how glider data are used, because it's a challenging data set to integrate into forecast models because the position of the data point keeps moving. And so for some forecasters, I think that can be a challenge. So we want to look at how the data are being used and to engage with the forecast community about, you know, what the character of these data really are, because of course, for them it's new, it's a new data stream. So that's another aspect that we're beginning to think about, but haven't got a clear path as to how we make that assessment and how we engage with that particular community.
Yes, exactly. I mean, the impact of the glider data in numerical models is also a performance indicator in a way.
Right. So let me ask a related question of my own, which is, and you've hinted at it along the way, but how would you encapsulate the key advantages of gliders over other observing platforms? And have there been thought experiments or pilot experiments to look at the complementarity of different observing platforms to gliders?
Well, obviously, the real advantage of gliders is their mobility, so that they're able to sample and in regions where, you know, drifting Lagrangian platforms are at the fate of the current systems themselves. And so that's why, you know, sampling in front of, you know, storm events or sampling in boundary currents, gliders seem a very good tool, because like a slow-moving ship, they can head in the direction you want them to go. And so I think that's you know, the key central advantage to gliders. And there was a second part to that, Albert. Sorry, I was.
Have there been some thought experiments or pilot studies to look at that complementarity between different types of observation networks?
So there have been some, I would describe them as still preliminary efforts to look at, you know, design simulation experiments to look at how to, you know, around the boundary currents, we've talked about this, you know, using OSSE kinds of modeling exercises to compare the strengths and weaknesses of different platforms or vehicles, recognizing that gliders should only be one component of it, because, you know, Argo floats already exist at the outer edge in the open water, but it could be a combination of, in some region, moorings and gliders or other drifters. And so we certainly suggest that gliders are the appropriate platform for a component of these observing activities, but we recognize a need to, you know, engage with the others. And to do that in a field experiment is one way, but that's slow and expensive and time consuming. It's not immediate through modeling exercises, but we have been talking with Ocean Predict people about this, and there was some work in Atlantos developing OSSE experiments, and there are a couple of white papers that summarize that, but that work was never really applied to the glider activities. So I think that's that's a real opportunity, I think, there to further demonstrate what the best mix is, depending on the question you ask, the region you're in, and the resources that are available.
Thanks, Brad. We have another question about the capabilities of gliders. Is it possible to measure underwater noise and noise pollution?
I guess I can answer that because we have within our group an interest directly in doing that. Gliders are quite quiet vehicles, although sometimes the pump in the glider or moving the batteries around can be noisy. So not very noisy. It's not like children screaming, but it still can be somewhat interfering. But a number of groups have put hydrophones on gliders. The U.S. Navy has some interest in this for obvious reasons. And so, yeah, I think they're a very good platform for passive acoustics with the hydrophone. You could, in principle, put a hydrophone separated far enough to do directional sound, depending on the frequency you're interested in. And there are some interests in using gliders, for example, to look at ship noise, because you can then fly your gliders around ships or around shipping lanes to look at that, because underwater noise is obviously one of the kind of growing pollution issues in the ocean. And I think gliders do make a good platform for mapping that out. Another opportunity for gliders is to look at bubble noise and wind noise in the ocean. But again, you have to be a little careful in removing noise from the glider itself, depending on which platform it is. Some of them have pumps for the CTD, and the pump can make background noise that will mask some of the other interesting signals. So yeah, I think the short answer is yes.
Thanks, Brad. We have a great question from Kane Kamaki. His interest is in the Canadian side of the Beaufort Sea, where there's no glider or Argo networks on your maps. We don't have gliders yet, but what's the best way to reach out to your community? And in your current or future plans, do you have any plans for communal gliders that would be shared amongst institutions?
I think on the international scale, our expectation is that gliders will still primarily be operated nationally, and that what we're going to do is to try to coordinate national activities. On the Beaufort Sea, on the Canadian side of the Beaufort Sea, there are glider operations in Canada led by Fisheries and Oceans from the Institute of Ocean Sciences. So Tatiana Ross there, and on the East Coast from Dave Hébert and Clark Richards. And so they fly a mixture of Elsimer gliders and sea gliders on the West Coast. Those would be the two groups that would likely have some potential interest in deploying in the Arctic, in the Beaufort Sea. I know it's Fisheries and Oceans' intention to make gliders available within the Fisheries and Ocean network. As I say, the idea of a pool of international gliders is one that we haven't really discussed yet. I mean, it's certainly not impossible, but it would be challenging to kind of support and maintain. So it's our expectation that what we're doing right now is working to integrate and better support national activities rather than building an international glider facility per se.
Okay, thanks, Brad. And I'll ask the last question, which might be a little bit difficult to answer immediately, so maybe I'll turn it around a bit. So this is from Brian Melzian. He wants to know, what are the brands of the most common gliders used now around the world, and why are they being used? And I suspect that's quite a hard question to answer, but is there a contact point in OceanGliders where this could be discussed in greater detail?
The answer is that there are not that many manufacturers of gliders, though there are many groups, research groups, that are building autonomous underwater vehicles. So around the planet, there are engineering groups that can now build them with some ease. So the largest number is probably produced by Teledyne Webb, the Slocum glider, which is built in Massachusetts and is sold globally. And so they have many hundreds of gliders that they have sold, and they've got versions G1, G2, G3. There's a French group, Alcimera, that builds a glider that's a relatively new entrant to the market, and I think they've sold a few tens of gliders, and their gliders have somewhat different characteristics. They all have different characteristics, strengths and weaknesses. There's then a glider built by now by Königsberg, which was originally designed by Charlie Erickson at the University of Washington, Sea Glider, which is a more elegant glider. Of all the gliders, it's the most elegant of the vehicles in design and complexity, somewhat more expensive as a result. And there's then Spray Glider, which was built by or designed at Scripps. And I'm not sure there really is a commercial version of Spray. It's mostly operated by people from Scripps and then used elsewhere. There are noises of other groups. Certainly China is showing some interest around building a commercial vehicle. But for the moment, it's a fairly small number of platforms out there. And probably, half or more are Slocum gliders, and then the Königsberg Sea Glider, and then Alcimera's gliders and Spray gliders are the kind of the platforms. But as I say, there are research glider groups that are building vehicles, glider-like vehicles and small platforms that are just for research purposes and not yet commercial. The last point about a point of contact. We don't really have a point of contact directly on that, though I think if somebody were interested and they contacted either Pierre or myself, we could pass along contacts to each of those vendors that I identified, because they're fairly easy to find. So I'd be happy to do that if anybody had an interest.
Okay, thank you, Brad. And thank you both, Brad and Pierre, because we're out of time. Thank you both for sticking through the technical difficulties and telling us about OceanGliders. You had a pretty interested audience who also stuck through the technical difficulties. So thank you to the audience, and we'll see you all next time on the GOOS webinar. Thanks.
Well, and thank you, Albert, and thank you, everyone. And, best wishes to all, and thanks, Pierre, too. Okay, bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Pierre. Bye-bye.
Bye.